And let me just give one word to Sandeep as co-organizer, and you can of course take some minutes to explain also the reasoning why CBAM is so important, why we discussed about the topic. We didn't want to focus only on CBAM, we wanted to do also EI and sustainability. So Sandeep, I give the word to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. So I'd like to take a roundabout way to explain how I got here. My name is Sandeep Bhattacharya. I'm a principal public sector specialist with ADB. My main job from the beginning has been to manage the Asia Pacific tax hub. And in fact, you know, the way we got involved in this kind of work in CBAM and other initiatives of this kind is essentially because of our mandate to look at taxes. As you know, that the CBAM is basically a kind of way of ensuring that producers in the EU who have to pay a carbon price do not suffer because of the fact that exporters in other countries do not often face carbon price at all, or at least one of the level that prevails in the EU. Now, since the carbon price obviously can come about in two different ways, or maybe more than two different ways, but primarily from carbon taxes, even if they are simplified carbon taxes, which like fuel excises, or from some sort of trading system. So that's actually where the tax hub got involved. It was through our mandate to intervene in the case of carbon taxation within the Asia Pacific. ADB, of course, also has a very strong climate mandate. And so it's not just a question of domestic resource mobilization, it is mitigation action as well. But while we were working in many of our developing member countries, or DMCs, as we call them, we found that quite a few of them became interested in carbon taxation, mainly because of the impending CBAM. And there were others who we feel are sort of not really aware of the issue or are not really actively taking steps to deal with it. In fact, that is why we have two of our DMCs presenting, Uzbekistan and Indonesia. Both are countries where the tax hub, is actively working in. Both of them had programs on domestic resource mobilization, and both of them were requesting ADB assistance on how to deal with the CBAM. And that is why we suggested to Irma that there may be two very interesting case studies to present in this kind of conference. Now, I'll take just another 2 or 3 minutes, not to talk about CBAM, but to tell you about ADB's work in this area and about the Asia Pacific Tax Hub. And then I will hand it back to Irma to take you through the rest of the meeting. So essentially, the tax hub is located in what is called the Public Sector Management and Governance Group within ADB. And what are the kind of challenges and actions that we can take, or our department thinks about taking, essentially to meet the debt, growth, climate kind of nexus challenges. Now, we focus on domestic resource mobilization, as I mentioned, but also on state-owned enterprise reform, private sector development, that is creating an enabling environment and governance framework, digital transformation, which is very important to us as well, banking sector reforms, financial sector modernization, which includes interventions of financial stability, green finance, and embedding climate adaptation within the macro fiscal framework. And of course, to some extent, on climate and disaster resilience. But that we have a full division within ADB to handle that. So, of course, our group does not get too involved in those things. Now, in domestic resource mobilization, what do we see as the challenges? So one is that the tax to GDP ratio in some countries remain below 15%, in some countries more or less around that level. Now, this is fairly low, especially when compared to the OECD countries. This country suffers from a lot of very generous and mostly ineffective tax expenditures or incentives. Indirect taxes are dominant, some of which are distortionary. Typically, there's weak tax administration, poor compliance, and lack of effective enforcement. So, therefore, in 2021, the ADB President Masa established this Asia Pacific Tax Hub to provide an open and inclusive platform for strategic policy dialogue, knowledge sharing, and development coordination among ADB, its members, development partners. In fact, this conference is being organized by ADB and Leiden University due to an MOU that exists between our universities to cooperate. And within that framework of the MOU, we actually have a partnership or a roadmap on collaboration on tax issues. And again, so to reemphasize, we ended up here through the tax angle and not necessarily through the climate angle, though the two are not really separate. So what do we do actually? So we give policy advice for strengthening the capacity of ministries, agencies responsible for these topics. We give loans, policy-based lending, and provide technical assistance to increase DRM. And we also give assistance in the area of international tax cooperation. Now, we do that through publication of several knowledge products. In fact, we have also published several knowledge products on carbon taxation. We have a carbon taxation and fossil fuel subsidy reduction toolkit and other documents. We regularly organize events, and this is one of them. I will make a shameless plug for our mega event, which is coming up in November, the High-Level Regional Tax Conference, where we have invited Irma as well to present in one of our sessions on VAT. So if any institutional people are interested in that event, we can maybe arrange for Zoom participation for you. As I said, we provide loans and technical assistance, and that is really how we look at this agenda from our point of view, working on carbon taxation mostly. So that's it from our side. I really hope you enjoy the events. You have some very interesting speakers lined up, a lot of ADB speakers as well. And now I hand it back to Irma. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. And I think that it's nice that you gave an introduction also to the ADB and the work that the Tax Hub is doing. I think that that's also important because it's what you say. I mean, we enter through the tax angle, but we are discussing sustainability, technology, and so forth. So, but right now we will start a little more with the tax international law angle, and we will look at the CBAM, AU, and Asia perspective. If you have any questions, I will just ask for the people who are not speaking to mute themselves, since we have a big audience, as well as also if you have any questions, just please ask them in the chat, and we will see whether we have time to take some questions in person or if we just reply with those in the chat. And the first part is CBAM, the AU and Asia perspective. And we have three scholars, very well known, very good friends. And so that actually it's a pleasure to have the group, starting with this group. I have with Rita Sudowski, who is from the Associate Professor Institute for Austrian and International Tax Law. Then after we will have Suranjali Tandon, Associate Professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in India, and Anna Marhold, Assistant Professor and now Coordinator also of the International, I will say, Law Master, if I'm correct, Anna, at Leiden Law School. So please, everyone will have 15 minutes. We will have these presentations one after another, and then we will gather for some questions. But in the meantime, if you have also some questions, just ask us in the chat. So please, Rita, you are welcome to start first.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irma, and thank you for the invitation and the organization of this very, very timely event. I'm really excited to be part of it and to be part of the discussion. As you will see, the CBAM will hit in reality from January next year already, when we will start to see the exact effects, the practical effects of CBAM within the European Union and on third countries as well. But before that, I would like to make an introduction to the CBAM. So basically a short overview, what it is about, what the main purposes of the CBAM is, and a bit of the controversies that surround the CBAM. Now I will share my slides. Is it okay now? Can you see? Okay, perfect. So what is the CBAM about? Basically, in order to explain the cross-border, this cross-border border adjustment mechanism, first we need to understand what's happening about carbon pricing within the EU. And that is basically described by the EU ETS system, the emission trading system, that is an internal carbon pricing instrument within the European Union. And the EU ETS is actually quite a long-standing cap and trade system that we have within the European Union. It was established in 2005, so we have quite some experience already with the ETS. Basically, it covers emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation, heat generation, industrial manufacturing, the aviation sector, and starting from last year, also the maritime sector. So it covers basically all greenhouse gas emissions within these sectors emitted by installations in the European Union. And what does it mean, this cap and trade system? Basically, it means that these installations within these sectors have to pay for the carbon that is emitted during their manufacturing operations or other operations. And how does it work? Basically, there is an overall quota within the European Union for greenhouse gas emissions. How many tons can be annually emitted within the European Union. And this is distributed between the different installations, the different operators who are covered by the EU ETS. What do? Basically, they need to there is an auction, so they need to bid for the ETS allowances. They have to pay a price which is set by the market. And this is what the allowances that they buy, this is what they can use for in order to pay for their emissions. What is the incentive effect? Basically, if an installation manages to introduce greener technologies and thereby reduce emission, the remaining ETS allowances can be traded. So it can be sold to other installations, other manufacturers within the EU who need more allowances because they emit more. And this is how a market is produced, basically, from these ETS allowances. So this is the internal system within the European Union, the so-called EU ETS system. And as you see on the slide, this means that the production costs for EU operators are higher, because they have to pay for their emissions through these ETS systems. Until now, producers outside the European Union didn't have to pay a carbon price, or depending on their local laws, depending on the local regulations in the country of origin. But in most countries, the case is that they didn't have to pay a carbon price for their greenhouse gas emissions, which means that producers outside the EU could produce at a lower price. And this meant, of course, a competitive disadvantage for EU producers who can only produce at a higher cost because of the payment obligations under the EU ETS. And what is the other consequence apart from this unequal playing field between EU producers and non-EU producers? The other consequences is the so-called carbon leakage, which you also see on the slide. This means that due to the fact that the EU has this carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing system, which makes production more costly, carbon intense production moves to countries where there are less strict carbon policies, less strict carbon emission standards. So this is what we call carbon leakage, and this is bad for everyone, actually, not only for the European Union, because the producers move out and basically cheaper import is brought into the European Union, whereby EU products are not competitive because of this price disadvantage, but it's also bad for the environment globally and bad for the cause of climate mitigation, because if polluting production simply moves out of the European Union, that means that the global greenhouse gas emissions will not reduce, or they may even increase due to this so-called carbon leakage phenomenon. And this was the main reason why the EU started to think about that we need a mechanism which basically mirrors or reproduces this internal EU system, the ETS system, for products which are imported into the European Union. And this is basically the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, through the CBAM, basically EU importers who import into the European Union carbon intensive products will also have to pay a price which equals to the carbon price which would have been paid if the product had been produced in the European Union. So basically this equalizes, CBAM equalizes the production costs of carbon intensive products. And a little bit more detail. So this is the idea, the underlying rationale and the underlying objective of the CBAM. Basically a compensatory carbon price on certain goods imported into the European Union, which matches the price of embedded emissions that are charged under the EU ETS. The CBAM was introduced via regulation, an EU regulation, which was adopted in May 2023. And now it covers only these 6 sectors: cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. So this is not, of course, everything that emits greenhouse gas during the production process, but these are basically the most, we can say, the most polluting industrial sectors, and which are the most exposed to the carbon leakage phenomenon. That is why they were chosen to be covered in this phase of the CBAM. So the CBAM was already introduced in 23, but the first phase was only a transitional period, which lasts until December this year. And in this transitional period, EU importers merely had to report their their emissions. So there was only a reporting obligation. Of course, that's already quite a burden because they had to be able to measure their carbon emissions. They had to be able to calculate the embedded emissions and they had to report it already. However, the obligation to start to pay, so basically the obligation to buy CBAM certificates, which cover the price of the emissions of your imported products, will only start from 1st of January next year. So that is the so-called definitive period for the CBAM. And now just a recap, what does the CBAM try to achieve? First of all, leveling the playing field between EU producers who operate in carbon-intensive industries and third country producers and importers in terms of the carbon pricing of goods. So that basically the production costs that are high in the EU don't compromise the competitiveness of EU producers. Then, of course, one of the overall or overarching main objective of the CBAM is to prevent carbon leakage, this phenomenon that I just explained, whereby the environmental purpose, the climate mitigation purpose of the Paris Agreement would be endangered if such mechanism was not in place, because polluting productions would simply move out of the European Union, but they would not cease to exist. Apart from it, of course, it is an incentive to third country producers in these sectors, which are covered by CBAM, to green their production, to introduce more environmentally friendly, less polluting technologies, which emit less greenhouse gas. Because if they do so, they will pay less when they import their products into the European Union. They also
Rita, let me tell you, you have like 2-3 minutes to conclude.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. The CBAM also gives an incentive to third countries to introduce carbon pricing. Why is that so? Because if in the local country, in the country of origin, there is already a carbon pricing mechanism, for example, a carbon tax, that can be credited against the CBAM. So it can be the CBAM obligation, the payment obligation can be reduced by the price that the producer had already paid in its country of origin. Apart from that, climate leadership is also an objective, of course, meaning that the European Union wants to ensure that high ambitious climate policies and high climate standards are introduced not only within the European Union, but also outside the European Union, non-EU countries, because that's simply necessary to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And finally, the CBAM also raises revenues, meaning that the CBAM will go to the EU budget and it will be an EU-owned resource. Of course, in the initial phase, it is not going to be a very substantial item in the EU budget. As far as I know, this will only be 3% of the EU-owned budget. But of course, the plan is to basically broaden the scope of CBAM. And finally, just a few words about the controversies. Of course, while the European Union perceives the CBAM as mainly a carbon mitigation instrument, which serves an environmental purpose. There are other opinions. There is quite some resistance from third countries. One is that basically it's a trade protectionist measure, that it is very similar to a tariff, or it is a tariff. This is what the United States new administration claims, that CBAM is a tariff, and it's basically just a trade barrier. Then it is also said that it has an extraterritorial outreach because it tries to regulate processes production processes which happen outside the European Union. It tries to export the European Union climate standards to third countries. It's criticized because they say that it's unfair to coerce third countries to introduce similar climate policies as are in place within the European Union, because for some of these countries, this would mean a disproportionate burden. And on the other hand, if we take into account historical emissions, the European Union has been historically, and developed countries in general, very big polluters. And now that developing countries, emerging economies are at the stage of economic development, this is a very big obstacle to their economic development if they have to introduce these strict emission regulations and standards. The other question is whether it's in line with the Paris Agreement's principle, underlying principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So all countries should take objectives or undertake objectives which are in line with their own capabilities. And WTO compatibility is also a question, as it is considered by some countries as a trade barrier. And finally, this is an EU law question, whether the legal basis of the CBAM regulation was the right legal basis, because it was adopted as a primarily environmental measure. The question is that whether it's a fiscal measure, because if it was a fiscal measure, then it should have been adopted through a unanimous vote in the European Union, in the EU Council. And I think that's all as a brief introduction, and I'm very much looking forward to the other speakers and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita, for this presentation. I think that this gives the whole overview also for the people who are not familiar with the CBAM, why CBAM is important, what we need to know about CBAM, and also the problems at EU level. So I just go to the second speaker, and that would be Suranjali. I will ask Suranjali if Rita can perhaps, perfect, and then Suranjali can share her slides. We have 15 minutes, and because we want to also give time for questions. So, but I see you have 4, and you have all the economics of it. So I'm very happy to have you, Suranjali, today at this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Irma, and thank you, ADB, for putting this together. I think Rita's done a splendid job of explaining what the CBAM, how the CBAM is going to work, and also what the major contentious issues are. So I'll just pick up from where she left. From the Asia perspective, sort of give a sense of how countries like India are thinking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. To start with, as Rita had already mentioned, there are 6 sectors that are being covered at the moment in the first phase of CBAM. And this is quite important because countries like India are dependent on sectors like iron and steel, fertilizer and aluminium for exports to regions such as the EU. And what this has created is sort of an impulse response amongst countries to sort of create their internal frameworks which would align better with the CBAM. Of course, it caused a stir. There was questioning of whether this measure is actually possible under international law, whether this is fair. India has raised many of these questions at COP and outside. But what remains is that, at the moment, you can go ahead and will go ahead with this. This will, of course, have a backward impact onto economies which are trade dependent. There are a few studies which have looked at this impact. So, for example, there is a study by the London School of Economics which looks at which countries may be more impacted, both in terms of trade and then on the economy. And it seems that they're located in different regions. So you have countries like Mozambique, for example, in Africa would be adversely affected. There's no surprise that India and China will have an impact to the levy of CBAM. Now, the interesting thing is that the level of preparedness within Asia would be quite varied across countries. So, for example, we know that China already had its first phase of the ETS-like system, where it had 5 provinces covered by the emission trading system, and now it's a national trading system. On the other hand, you have countries like India, which have not yet set up a carbon market for themselves. The question is, if there are current measures such as taxes or excise taxes that countries like India levy to a large extent on consumption of oil and gas. If you look at coal production and consumption, there are a myriad of taxes that are applied at the national and subnational level. So the questions that developing countries would raise and should raise is that what is the use of such taxes and how do they, sort of comply with the CBAM? Can they be counted as form of tax paid compliant with CBAM? It may not be levied on emissions, but it nevertheless is on consumption and production of fossil fuels. Another important economic impact which has come to the fore, especially through discussions with the steel sector within countries like India, is that CBAM has managed to create a wedge between companies which are large multinationals, and there are companies which are small and medium. So why I give the example of large multinational enterprises is that the classic example given in India is of Tata Steel, which exists both within India and EU. They have their Netherlands facility, which they're trying to decarbonize quite swiftly. They sort of write in the annual reports that they've looked at fiscal measures of fiscal support as a way to transition within the EU, as they were covered under the ETS. At the same time, there are in countries like India, it's difficult to provide the kind of support that is available to decarbonize there. And what is possible for such companies is to think of technology transfer or transfer of best practices between jurisdictions. But then, if you look at their supply chains, they're quite varied. You have small enterprises which exist within that value chain, and if the compliance with BAM is to be met, then these companies as well will have to, with their limited wherewithal, think of how they help large corporations comply with CBAM. If they directly supply to jurisdictions such as the EU, they may be adversely affected because they may not be in the position to change their process of production. So what the imposition of CBAM does is that it creates an added burden of reporting, which has created a sense amongst companies that they may be a cost push. But on the positive side, there is some thinking on what the government can do to nudge some of these companies to move to greener ways of working. So after the CBAM, there was a lot of discussion on how the Indian government will respond. While they may bilaterally be engaging with the European Commission, there's also internal thinking on what is green for the Indian steel industry. So what they've come up with is taxonomy, which is guidance on what activities qualify as green for the steel sector specifically, which will provide companies some kind of sense of what they can raise money on from financial markets on greening of the sector. But of course, this doesn't do away with the issue of costs to the company. I think EU is cognizant of this, so it's very interesting that they have launched a public consultation on how this would affect countries. And I think one of the things that need to be discussed is that what would be the actual impact? Is there a possibility at all to think about how these prices across different jurisdictions measure up against each other? Because if you look at the experience of EU ETS, it is a 2-decade-long experience. There was the first phase of free allowances, which were then done away with, which of course you see in the raising of prices in the EU ETS market. There were fiscal support available to companies or installations to transition, and that was possible through the revenue generation. So a lot of countries that are exporting to the EU market do not have that history, do not have that pace. And I think Rita raised the point of, the principle of CBDR. Now, if the Paris Agreement allows countries to transition at their own pace, the question is that does the CBAM hasten that pace by sort of mandating countries to comply with EU standards? And I guess it's an open question, which relates back to how much should countries price carbon within their jurisdictions and what is compatible with the level of economic growth. A 70 euro price on an EU ETS, which will be linked back to the CBAM, may not be affordable for countries which have sort of lower prices. I will show you on a slide what the prices look like today. And I think one of the related issues is that even if the CBAM goes through, the revenues are generated, there is an allocation mechanism, a part of it stays back with the jurisdiction that's levying, a member state that is, and then the rest is into the EU budget. The question is on what activities will receive it, to what extent is it possible to recycle this revenue beyond the borders of EU. So just to give a sense of where we are on pricing, as Sandeep had mentioned at the very beginning, you can price in different ways. You can have a tax, you can have an ETS, and if you see different countries, even there are sub-national markets, and there is quite a bit of variation from the EU ETS. So for example, even if you look at countries like South Africa, Brazil, and India, which are within the BRICS sort of group, they're quite below the EU ETS. This raises the question of, can you apply the same level of carbon price to a country which may not be at the same level of development as the EU? So what is a measure that countries can take to at least safeguard against this? One of the key pillars of transition, of course, is the tax expenditure side. What we notice is that, again, there have been use of tax incentives to promote environmental sustainability. And, there was the announcement of the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course has been pared down with the Big Beautiful Bill. You also have the Green New Deal, which had support from the fiscal side. And this has been in part possible through revenue generation. If you look at the graph, which shows high average income countries and their share of tax expenditures on environmental sustainability, you see that there's a drop up to 2021, which mirrors what or which looks exactly like what you've seen for the EU. So it's driven in part by the EU. So the question is, you may have had the advantage of giving these incentives in early phases, which have now tapered off, whereas developing countries or low-income countries have seen a dip nevertheless. And will they have the fiscal wherewithal within their overall, debt and fiscal deficit situation? Will they have the wherewithal to give the incentives that are faster to meet some of these demands? This would, of course, be true for countries which have relatively more exposure to the EU market. Second is, how do they create domestic taxes which look like a carbon tax? So going back to my earlier point that do existing taxes match the system, or do they need to increase the level of taxes rate or base to come at par not only in terms of the EU, but also their own ambition to transition. And all of this is linking back again to the negotiation based on the level of economic development. I will stop there and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suranjali, because I think that starting with Rita and having the legal basis for the CBAM and looking at the perspective of Asia and specifically India and developing countries on CBAM, And now we are going to go to another level of also looking the perspective of CBAM and international law. And Anna, you also kindly share with us the recent, but very recent, like 1 month ago, the Dutch Advisory Council on International Affairs report from the Netherlands, looking at Europe, the Global South in a changing world order. So you have there the link in the chat. Very nice, because it's also in English, so that you can share it. But Anna, please, the word is, I give the word to you. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just ask about during the chat. We will also discuss tax incentives next week. Sorry, next week, tomorrow, with Mahmoud. But please feel free to ask some questions now in the chat, and we will go ahead with Anna. Anna, please go ahead.
Thank you, Irma. Thank you so much also for organizing this very relevant workshop. I think we are really, I hope you can see my shared slide at the moment. Yes. So thank you very much for organizing this workshop. It remains, of course, a very relevant topic. I am a lawyer, but I actually want to, a bit unconventionally, start the presentation from a policy perspective, because looking at the discussions that we just had, I want to kind of take a step back and focus on CBAM and EU unilateral policies as a double-edged sword. They might have mainly noble intentions, but they also might backfire in the way Europe implements these policies. And this is something I would like to focus on, and at least for us to be mindful of in implementing these types of unilateral policies that might have the best interests at heart, essentially. So what I want to focus on first is the EU and unilateral policies in the global south. And then I want to briefly discuss CBAM as a double-edged sword in that context. Why did I share the report? So I'm part of the Dutch Advisory Council of International Affairs. We are a body that advises Parliament and the government. And in the past year, we worked intensely on a report on the Netherlands, Europe, and the Global South in the changing world order. I indeed put the link in the comments. It's also in English. It's a 70-page report. And we basically saw the need to publish this report because in this kind of changing geopolitical global order, we see that we are going towards a multipolar world order where we are getting into a more transactional landscape. Our relations with the Global South, and you can talk about the term, what is the Global South? We also discussed it in a report, really drastically need changing. And in that context, also policies such as CBAM or the, for instance, deforestation regulation. We basically see that the Netherlands and Europe are still very much stuck in old world thinking, while the world has moved on. And reality is that we, as the Netherlands and Europe, we will need the Global South. You don't need us as much as we will need you. And this is a realization that I think for many countries in the Global South is already a known fact, but it still has to kind of land here. What did we do? We did in-depth interviews with policymakers and stakeholders in the Global South, including many from Asia, for instance, on Indonesia and Vietnam. And we asked about EU trade policies, generally diplomatic cooperation and so on, and also unilateral policies. And the sentiment that we really got is that the EU on the one hand is seen as a, let's say, on the one hand, comes up with innovative and daring policies such as the CBAM, which can be seen as, taking initiative and taking action with regard to climate change that maybe other trading blocs don't dare to take. But on the other hand, we also suffer very much from double standards. And we also are seen as bringing the moral high ground. And therefore, these policies that might have the best intentions with regard to, let's say, decarbonization also are met with a lot of resistance in the way that we try to implement and communicate them in the Global South. So there's a serious attitude shift needed from the Netherlands and Europe in this sense. And we have to be very careful with these types of unilateral policies so that they don't backfire, in fact. And that's what I think they are really a double-edged sword. Europe definitely needs to step up its engagement and the way in it engages with the global south, because otherwise we really risk loss of relevance, influence, and prestige in the world. And it's an uncomfortable truth, but it's the reality. You can see it also how main trading partners have changed with regard to Asia and Europe. So between 1995 and 2022, Asia, in fact, displaced Europe as the main trading partner for most of the countries of the global south, both in terms of imports and exports. So we also have to be mindful of these global shifts in population, in trading patterns, and so on. That we have to understand. So if we look at some of the criticisms that were perceived with the interviews from the global south, and we did them geographically in Asia, Africa, Latin America, very diverse groups, several tensions came to the fore. For instance, the controversy concerning the EU anti-deforestation regulation, which really seeks to curb European imports of products that contribute to forestation. Basically, Malaysia and Indonesia argue that Brussels is really unilaterally imposing rules without really regard for their farmers or development ambitions, placing an extra burden on implementing these rules. And our first speaker indeed also talked about, the extraterritorial reach of the EU in this sense. So of course, again, it's with maybe the best intentions, but it also really comes with a burden for countries of the global south. Now, you also see that this has a concrete effect on the trust of the EU as a partner. We can see that in Malaysia and Indonesia, there is a big distrust of the EU as a trading partner compared to South Asia as a whole, a difference that really the report partly attributes to, for instance, having unilateral policies such as the deforestation regulation. Now, likewise, we also see that there is opposition to the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, we just saw our previous speaker that very interestingly also talked about some of the positive knockoff effects in India with regard to CBAM. But I remember that when CBAM was announced at the beginning, India already said that they would challenge, they were planning to challenge CBAM in the WTO with regard to WTO compliance. And that's something I will cover in a bit. Basically, it is also seen as a form of protectionism, and that's also what our first presenter discussed. It is seen as protectionism that goes hand in hand with environmental objectives, and of course, it's very hard or extremely hard to disentangle these two. It is true that it does pose an enormous administrative burden on countries that might already have a challenge to, especially for small and medium enterprises, to abide by trading policies and so on. So it's also the fact that a lot of these tensions could have been mitigated. The EU is not great in communicating in a timely manner and involve the global south in an equal way. This is also because of the EU's complex internal structure, and European initiatives are just often discussed with southern partners at a very late stage. If we would do this better, we would prevent quite a lot of these tensions. And in fact, it can backfire and it can damage even our relations with countries in the global south. So earlier dialogue could have actually mitigated points of contention, for instance, by including exemptions, etc. So this is really a communication issue and involving your trading partners in these ambitions at an earlier stage as well. So what can we do? We really want to, we are accepting that we might be going to this multipolar world order, and we have to try and also position the EU as a equal partner in cooperation with the global south. That means really better and more trade agreements, but also trade agreements that leave both sides with enough policy space that help actively shape their sustainable development. We should pay more attention to South Asia and Southeast Asia in this sense. There also just has to be an attitude shift. There has to be a more constructive attitude towards the global south in Brussels. And just as mentioned before, some of these, to mitigate some of these negative effects in the global south, with regard, for instance, to sustainability standards, we have to communicate with our trading partners our ambitions earlier and in a clear way. And, which is always a challenge for Europe, we should also approach it in as a Team Europe way, which is hard because, of course, all the competences. Now, very briefly, it was clear from the beginning with CBAM, of course, you know, before CBAM was launched or just after, the EU would often in all kinds of meetings and conferences say, yes, CBAM is 100% WTO compliant. The reality is we don't know whether it's WTO compliant. And it was clear from the beginning that dispute settlement proceedings regarding CBAM would be kind of inevitable. It's a complex instrument where there are many potential violations with WTO law. And as I mentioned, indeed, in the early days, India stated that it might take CBAM to dispute settlement. However, who did indeed start a dispute against Europe in the WTO with regard to CBAM? We knew it would happen. We didn't per se expect it would be Russia. So it is Russia that actually that started consultations with the EU for CBAM as a discriminatory policy. And this is very interesting for various reasons. If you look at the legal challenges it posed, it was the obvious ones that you could have expected from the beginning. Obviously, most favored nation treatment, which countries are exempted and for what reason. Then, of course, you have likeness in Article 2 of the GATT. To what extent are some of the products, not like, if you look at non-product related process and production methods. National treatment, obviously, is there discriminatory treatment with regard to imported CBAM products? Is it a quantitative restriction? Does it limit access of these particular products under the CBAM into the European market? And of course, there's the problem of free allocations and allowances. That was an issue from the beginning. So the challenges that Russia brought were predictable. However, I think we should be very mindful of the fact that this is not just about the law for several reasons. So first of all, CBAM is an easy target as a policy, and the EU does have to improve its manner in which it develops these policies, also with regards to its attitudes towards the global south. So it's completely understandable that CBAM should be tested under international trade rules. But I do think, personally, that Russia took this opportunity to really hijack the issue under the pretense of free trade, while instead it's also gathering momentum on capitalizing these anti-European sentiments for their own political agenda. So it's a very cunning approach, to be honest, to state this, to also understand that this is also used for a particular political goal. Because in practice, what chance of successful dispute settlement can there be at the moment? We've seen it with the other cases with regard to the appellate body that's not functioning at the moment. The other EU-Russia case with regard to the energy package was also appealed into the void. So there's an enormous likelihood the same will happen here. So it's a lot of symbolism behind these types of consultations also. I hope that this was a bit useful. I don't have an easy answer nor an easy solution. I do encourage you to read the report. I hope you find it useful. And if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think it is wonderful. Sometimes when I think about the way that we start the conferences and we start the speakers, and I think that the order was perfect, just by having first explaining the EU CBAM and the legal basis and what is the reasoning behind, but then after looking at the effect of the CBAM in developing countries, also with economics, and you are giving the international law, WTO law perspective. And I think that we may have time for one question. And So think from the ADB finance sector team, from the ADB means the Asian Development Bank. Does CBAM require non-EU exporters to account for GHG emission scope 2 or may scope 3 value chain emissions? In that case, what implications that it had for SMEs in exporter supply chain? The question is already in the chat. I will say that I don't know who will be brave enough to take this question. I will say, I don't know if Suranjali will want to start perhaps. Yes, I thought so. Thank you so much. And perhaps if Rita or Anna want to comment on something. Suranjali, please go ahead.
Thanks, Irma, and thanks, Tim, for that question, because that's one of the points that I raised. So at the moment, there is already, for example, in countries like India, there is a reporting of emissions in the value chains required for top 1,000 listed companies, and some of these companies would be impacted by CBAM. So in some sense, there has been some transition towards preparedness, but what this would do is to require SMEs to account for their emissions, because this is ultimately embedded in the inputs of these exporters to the EU, which in turn requires accounting by the SME. So yes, it would be an added cost of compliance.
Thank you so much, Suranjali. I have another question, so I think at the response of Suranjali, unless that Rita and Anna wants to say something else very quickly. Otherwise, I have another question from Stira Harikantik. So basically, if climate justice is about historical responsibility, does CBAM invert that principle by punishing today global south for yesterday global north emission? And then the question is in the chat. But if Rita, you will want to comment on the previous question, it's also okay. Or if you want to also address this question, you feel free. I think that Anna will take this second, but you can comment, Rita, either now on this question or the previous question.
Yes, on the previous one, I just wanted to say that there are de minimis rules under CBAM, and I think that was the latest amendment of the CBAM regulation, which was adopted actually yesterday or the day before yesterday, to expand the de minimis rules. So basically, those emissions, which the amount of minimal emissions which do not have to be reported, they were increased and expanded. So this will help to a certain extent SMEs and individuals, individual importers to the European Union. But of course, the issue is a bit more complicated, as Suranjali mentioned, if SMEs are in the value chain of big importers, and embedded emission has to take into account downstream emissions as well. That will not solve the problem of SMEs, that's true. And
Thank
about historical emissions, yes, I think Anna should comment on that, but my take on that is always that, yes, historical emissions an issue, and from the point of view of fairness, we can always bring it up. But if we want to find a solution for current problems, as especially future-oriented problems, which is global climate change, which is global warming, I think then it's not very useful, it's not very instructive to talk about historical emissions.
Thank you so much, Rita. Let me go to Anna for the final words on such a big, difficult question, because I think it will take a lifetime to answer this one. So Anna, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is not, I wouldn't see it as punishing today's global south. Of course, it's easy to see it like that at first glance. But I do think in the ideal sense, it's seen as level playing field, as creating a level playing field, in addition to ensuring that the income that the EU receives from CBAM is channeled back to also making those countries that need it most more climate resilient. So there is, I would say, and I think we have Jason here, who is of course an expert on environmental law, and he'll be able to tell you later, but I wouldn't say it's a flipped polluter pays principle. I do believe that CBAM has, has at heart the best interest, but it will also have this flip side of protectionism, and we have to hope that there is some compensation also, that CBAM actually uses those funds in a good way.
Thank you so much, Anna, and I'm very happy that we are recording this, because the information we are sharing is also new, nice, but also very relevant for everyone, and Jason will also present tomorrow. So we will have, I will move to the next panel, and the next panel we invited, thanks to the Asian Development Bank, we invited the response of Asian Development Bank countries, member countries to CBAM. And the first speaker will be Hadi Setiawan. She's from my policy is not a she, a he. He's from Indonesia, from the Minister of Finance, and you will have approximately 15 minutes for your presentation. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat, and we will try to make also some room for some questions like we did it right now. Mr. Setiawan, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Irma. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, perfectly, yes. And I make you pause so you could share your slides.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good morning and afternoon, Prof. Irma, Sandeep, and other organizers, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's a pleasure for me to join this workshop. And as we know that CBAM is significant new policy tools from the EU designed to align trade with its internal climate standards. While it is a step forward in reducing carbon leakage, it also raised concern for developing countries whose exports such as steel, aluminum, fertilizer, and cement that are now subject to additional compliance costs. So today's discussion is a timely opportunity to exchange insight on how the Asian economics, including Indonesia, can participate this challenge, mitigate risk, and also at the same time leverage opportunities for greener transition. My name is Hadi Setiawan, and I'm a senior policy analyst from the Directorate General of Economy and Fiscal Strategy, Ministry of Finance, Republic of Indonesia. So I will start my presentation by exploring the EU CBAM global exposure and Indonesia's position. As you can see here that the Indonesia's relative exposure to the EU CBAM is only 0.0075. It is much lower compared to the countries like Egypt, Uzbekistan, and also India. This comes from the World Bank relative CBAM exposure index that highlight that the countries are most vulnerable based on their carbon emission intensity and the share of CBAM carbon exports going to the EU. Several developing countries such as Egypt and India export significant volume of carbon-intensive goods like iron, steel, and aluminum, making them far more exposed to the risk of CBAM. While for the Indonesia, lower index value that suggests that the challenge is narrow but still relevant for specific sector. Many countries have expressed different views, and already said about it, on the CBAM, depending on their domestic carbon pricing readiness and the nature of their trade relation with the EU. You can see here Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, and also the Russia that, like Anna said, that already proposed this to the WTO. Brazil labels CBAM as discriminatory, and then China argue that CBAM will impose significant cost burden on its export. while India and South Africa also voiced concern. India estimates CBAM could raise costs for its steel industry by more than 50% by 2034, and then therefore they demand exemption for small business that I think already agreed, if I'm not mistaken, by the EU. And then while South Africa also argued that CBAM undermine multilateral trust and risk violating with WTO rules. While when we see Indonesia, the overall impact of the EU CBAM on Indonesia trade is expected to be limited, since the share of the CBAM covered commodities export to Europe represent only a very small fraction to the total domestic production. And you can see here that between 2019 and 2022, the average export to the EU just 1.8% of aluminum, 2.2% of iron and steel, and 0.4% of fertilizer. And we don't export the cement and also electricity. The government is still assessing options such as carbon tax and also emission trading system for the IPPU sector. But in the short term, Indonesia is prioritizing energy transition initiative like efficiency improvement to gradually align with the global carbon pricing expectation. Here is the impact in the short term. In the short or medium term, you can see here that Indonesia exports are negatively affected by CBAM, but over the longer horizon, trade diversion gradually offset this impact as Indonesia products find new markets outside the EU. Here, imports project to rise because the CBAM covered goods that can no longer be sold in the EU will be redirected into global markets. For example, also in Indonesia. So Indonesia will becoming a destination for these diverted products. That's what we are worrying about. And as the result, the Indonesia's trade balance deficit is expected to increase, with the country absorbing some of the adjustment costs created by the EU carbon border measure. But in the macroeconomics indicator, you can see here, the overall macroeconomic impact is minimal. CBAM only reduced export by only 0.1%, and GDP is only effect so small, 0.0002%. But the welfare, we will lose the welfare around $36 million. And then this is mainly from the chemical, iron and steel and mineral, but the limited scope is explained by narrow product coverage. And then what Indonesia respond to the climate change. So I will talk about the climate change as a whole. The Indonesia has a commitment and milestone in tackling the climate change. We have been engaging in global climate governance since ratifying the UNFCCC in 1994, and then the Kyoto Protocol in 2004, and then we play a central role as a host of the COP13 in Bali in 2007, and over the years, Indonesia has strengthened its domestic framework through the adoption of National Action Plan on Mitigation in 2011, and then National Action Plan on Adaptation in 2014, and we ratified the Paris Agreement and submit our first NDC in 2016, and then follow the climate budget tagging, and recently we are submitted and updated an NDC, and also we established a carbon tax regulation and presidential regulation on carbon pricing in 2021. So when we see the Indonesia NDC, we begin with the first NDC submitted in 2016, 2016, and then followed by the update NDC, and then recently the enhanced NDC. The enhanced NDC here reflect the stronger commitment for Indonesia, raising the unconditional emission reduction target from 29% to 31.89% by 2030, and then the unconditional target from 41% to 43.2% based on the international support. So this target are set so that Indonesia must achieve reduction over 900 million tons under the unconditional scenario and more than 1.2 billion tons under the conditional scenario. Beyond that, beyond the 2030, Indonesia also laid a pathway toward achieving carbon neutral by 2060 or sooner. And then what we have achieved over the past 3 years, 2021 to 2023, Indonesia has managed to reduce the GHG emission significantly below the business as usual, as well as the CM1 and CM2 scenarios. We recording a surplus reduction around 1 million tons, 1,000 million tons, which confirm that the country's trajectory is consistent with its enhanced NDC. You can see here that the energy sector and the value sector is perform a dominant contributor to achieve our target to reduce the NDC below the CM1 and the CM2. And then what government do? Government specifically from the fiscal tools. We have revenue policy, and then also state expenditure and budget financing. On the revenue policy, we have provide much incentive, for example, VAT cuts, property tax reduction, tax allowance, tax holiday, and also luxury tax incentive for electric vehicle and used to ensure a just and affordable energy transition. From the state expenditure policy, we also includes ecological fiscal transfer to region, disaster financing mechanism, and dedicated spending for green infrastructure. And from the financing policy, we also pioneer issuance of the global and retail green sukuk, and then we have SDGs bonds with dedicated teams, social green and blue focus, and then samurai blue bond. So collectively, this fiscal measure demonstrate how Indonesia is positioning its budget as a catalyst for green growth, acting not only as a shock absorber in times of crisis, but also as a key driver of structural transformation toward a more sustainable economy. And in terms of the carbon pricing, we have presidential regulation number 98/2021 that established a comprehensive framework for the carbon pricing in Indonesia, designed to reduce greenhouse gas emission, correct market failure, and implement the polluters pay principle, while it also opening opportunity for state revenue and sustainable growth. This regulation provide for two instruments, trading instrument and non-trading instrument. For the trading, we know that we have the ETS and emission offset, and then for the non-trading instrument, we have the carbon tax or carbon levy and the result-based payment. And this is the ETS. We have implemented the ETS for the power generation. And in the first phase, 2023, the Indonesia power sector ETS already involved 99 units. It consists of the installed capacity 33.7 gigawatt. And in 2024, we add this implementation it's already covered 149 units with the 38.3 gigawatt of the capacity. And then in the beginning of 2025, we begin the second phase. It's already consists of 615 units of the power plant. Then the total capacity is 84.5% for 84.5 gigawatt of the coal power plant. And in terms of the carbon market, we already launched the Indonesia Carbon Exchange in September 2023. You can see here that the progress is quite good. From the 16 users at the beginning, and now until August 31st, it's already 124 users. And also in the trading volume and the trade value and the transaction. So based on all of this, I think I would like to say that the Indonesia CBAM is not as a trade challenge, but as an opportunity to accelerate our green transition, and also strengthen carbon pricing. And I hope we can work with international partners toward a fair and sustainable future. Thank you, Irma. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Setiawan. Adi, we will have also the second presentation, and that will be Mr. Ulmas Jurajev from the Uzbekistan, the Minister of Finance Tax Policy. Please ask your questions in the chat, and we will have some time for answering those questions. In the meantime, I just give you the word to Mr. Ulmas. Please go ahead.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's me, Ulmas. I'm from Uzbekistan. I work as the Minister of Economy and Finance, as Tax, Customs Policy and Revenue Forecasting Department. It's my great honor today to address a subject that's directly reshaping the global trade and climate policy, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. For countries like Uzbekistan, this represents both a challenge and opportunity. A challenge that we rely more on exports of most carbon-intensive products, as an opportunity, like it allows us to accelerate our green transition and modernization of green infrastructure. So, and let me just share the presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
So let me just, I think the CBAM, now the auditorium has a lot of knowledge about the CBAM. So I will not be going into details about what is CBAM. So I will give a quick brief about my country. So Uzbekistan climate is a climate continental with an average summer temperature, high temperature 40 degrees, in the winter low degrees, it's about 23 degrees. So we have the population about 37 million. It's the largest one in Central Asia, with the GDP as of 2024, 115 billion USD. So we are having in the past several years annual growth of 6%. If you look at the sectoral structure of our GDP by types of economic activity, the major contributors are services, industry, agriculture, construction, with the services has the largest share. So our country has also made a lot of commitments under international agreements of climate change, including Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and Global Methane Pledge. So we have made a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP by 35% by 2030 compared to 2010. And we have also joined Global Methane Pledge, a collective effort to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30%. So if you look at the number of projects we have implemented, so Ministry of Economy and Finance is the national coordinating body of these climate actions. And since 2016, we have implemented 15 projects, and we have achieved 15.2 million of GHG emission reduction. And Uzbekistan surprisingly ranks first among the CIS and Eastern European countries in terms of the number of projects implemented in mitigating climate action. So our commitments under Paris Agreement is to reduce the intensity, right? So if you look in 2010, we have GDP intensity, carbon intensity of GDP around 4 kilograms. By 2013, we have made commitment to reduce it to 2.61 kilograms. And GHG emissions also very high. I mean, if we can look like we emit around 200 million tons of CO2 per year, and that's a huge numbers. So to coordinate this, to implement it efficiently, we are also partnering with a number of international partners and organizations, including Asian Development Bank. We are developing our national ESG framework. We are working on carbon tax implementation and impact assessment. And we have also trying to work like export diversification strategy and CBAM risk mitigation strategies as part of our green climate initiatives. So we have developed our CBAM risk mitigation strategy, carbon tax roadmap, policy communication guidelines, and some economic initial impact assessments. Yes. So it's our goals. So I will not be spending much time on this. And yeah, CBAM. I will also point out some information about CBAM. CBAM is, as you know, is a complementary mechanism to increase the effectiveness of EU emission trading system, while it encourages producers from third countries to use technologies that are more efficient. It also tries to address carbon linkage from third countries that are being imported to EU countries. The sectoral coverage, 6 products, and Uzbekistan also has CBAM implications. We mostly fertilizers in aluminum and steel. If you look at this graph, you can see that share of CBAM products to total products to the world. Like mainly it's fertilizers, it's bars, it's urea, it's part of the iron in steel products. So the share is very high. I mean, the implications are also very high. So we have done some analysis of our exposure to CBAM based on 3 scenarios, based on 3 incentives, maximum, minimum, and default emission. So default emission here means we have used EU default factors per product. And if you see like the major component of our exports belong to fertilizers, and the major exposure of trade effect also belongs to fertilizers. So I will go to the trade effects of CBAM exposure. For fertilizer, under the maximum emission, the total trade effect is expected to be around $80 million. Under the minimum emission factors, it's calculated about $36 million. For iron and steel, under the maximum emission factors, it's about $19 million. Under the minimum emission, it's about $2 million. For aluminum, it's about 12 under the maximum emission intensity, under the minimum emission intensity is about 4%, 400,000 USD dollars. So if you look at the sectoral totals, total CBAM cost for us is about $50 million if we apply EU ETS price at about $80. So for calculation this, we have worked with AFD and we have used the default factors since we haven't fully implemented our national MRV systems at this stage. So we are relying on these default factors. So if we can look at this by types of subproducts for fertilizers, taking into account $80 per ton of CO2. Look, so if we implement, like, of course, $80, so we will not be paying anything in a sense. With a $10 price of carbon tax, the cost will be about 6 million euros. For $20, it's gonna be 12. For $30, it's gonna be $18 million. It's only for fertilizers. So with the $20 carbon price for CBAM impacted products, specifically for aluminum, iron in steel, and fertilizers, we're gonna increase the competitiveness of our exporters and remain about 30 million euros per year in our country. So the CBAM liability of our country will fall by 25%. So, but there's also one thing, you know, we have been working with many international organizations on the impact assessment of our products, and we have been training our exporters of major CBAM products. There are two things we are considering: either to keep the ambition in our country by implementing our national carbon tax or ETS, or we have the untapped export potential to other countries, so we can do some export diversification strategies rather than directly implementing carbon tax. So if you look, it's just a basic scenarios at this stage. So Kyrgyzstan is also our neighboring country, and we have a huge, they have net importer of these CBAM products, let's say fertilizers. So our exporters has opportunity also, if the prices will go up and this CBAM readiness will have create challenges, there are possibilities of diversifying their exports. But as part of our climate policy, as I said, like we have, we have obligation of reduction of CO2 intensities by 35% of GHG. So it's been a priority for us to follow our commitments. So for this, we are thinking of developing the initial phase of introduction of carbon tax for 5 major reasons. First is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The second one, enhancing fiscal sustainability and reducing fossil fuel subsidies, enabling compliance with EU CBAM for exporters, attracting climate alignment investments, and aligning with indices. So if we are aware, right, that it's paused, sorry. Can you hear me? I'm a bit lost.
Yes, we can. Completely, yeah.
Yeah. Now there are 2 things are being are ongoing. The first one is this national implementation of MRV system. For implementing carbon tax and being compliant to CBAM registry, we have to first have our own national MRV system. So in 2022, the presidential decree was adopted, 436, on accelerating the transition to green economy. And with this decree, it highlights the implementation of the MRV system, monitoring, reporting, and verification system for our major CO2 intensive sectors and producers. Why we need this? We need this because to mitigate CBAM risks, for example, if we apply default factors, the emission and carbon tax, let's say, obligations for our producer will be too high. So that's why we are working on developing our national MRV system so that we can be very transparent and verified on our obligations with international guidelines. So let's say there are 3 phases. Okay. Why am I? It's not working. Okay. So there are 3 price scenarios: $5, $10, and $25 till the 2030. Let's say, as we know, like if we implement national carbon tax, our exporters will have the opportunity to get deduction on their payment. For example, if they pay domestic tax of $10, and if the current EU ETS price is about $60, the total CBAM cost would be about $50. So it depends on what would the price effect. So so we are working on applying the right price measures, because you cannot just simply apply $80 because there would be high obligation, I mean the high burden for our exporters at the first stage. So it's envisaged to gradually increase and to make them ready. And the carbon tax is as a mitigating strategy for combating CBAM risks, has been developed to introduce at the first stage at the CBAM covered sectors with the upstream approach. So there's one thing also we're considering, as you know, the introduction of a new tax has always been very challenging. You always have political challenges, resilience, everything. So there's also one opportunity, I mean the possibility of the reformulation of the current excise tax, not based on the fixed units, but based on the carbon content of the products. So there are 2 approaches, either to introduce a new chapter as a carbon tax, or reformulating the current excise tax system and starting to tax based on the carbon content of certain products that are CBAM vulnerable. And yes, so I will just highlight some macroeconomic impacts of our it's an initial stage, you know, using the CPAT model, IMF, World Banks, we have done some initial assessments. So if you apply $5 economy-wide and increase by $25 by 2030, we could cover 95% of CO2 emissions and by 90% in 2013. So if you apply economy-wide, so it basically means to all fuels. So but in terms of GDP growth, so our baseline GDP growth is, let's say by IMF estimations, is about 5.8% percentage points. So if we apply economy-wide, as you know, the carbon tax economy-wide, it gonna create cost increases of energy prices, and at the end, it might create a cost increase for consumers, and it might also discourage the economic activity, and it imply that GDP growth might slow down to about 1.2 percentage points. From the fiscal side, yes, starting point $5 and increasing to $25 to 2013. Cumulative net benefit would be about 15 billion USD. So it's just initial estimations. So we are working on this. We are working on deep estimations, not only from macroeconomic perspective, but also how it will affect the social, from social perspective, the social cost and total environmental cost. But we still think that it's very important to mitigate not only the CBAM risks, but also to complement and commit our climate commitments under international agreements. So it's very important. So so we also have been working with a number of international partners in training our exporters under CBAM mechanism. So sorry. Okay, now, yeah. Now we have visits of experts on-site support. We have trained our like chemical industries, and how they can be obliged, how they can do registry, how they can report their CO2 emissions to EU. Also, we also supported our companies like fertilizer producers, Mexmash, Novoye Azot, and our metal producers, so that they can be ready and report their CBAM, their CO2 emissions under CBAM mechanism. So it's also yes. Yeah, overall, our readiness for CBAM is both urgent and achievable, I think, because we are working on this. And I think by strengthening our MRV systems and completing this finalization stage by the next year, and engaging with the private sector and developing our national carbon tax, we can mitigate our risks, and we can achieve our climate commitments under Paris and Kyoto agreements. So that's all for us. I mean, I'm open for the question. I was very quick.
Yeah, so you did. Actually, you managed to present 27 slides in 20 minutes. So, and also with estimates. And we do have some questions. I will have first 2 questions here in the room. Should I ask you? You can ask them if you want to, Mr.
Yeah. Sorry, give me just 1 second. Like,
yes?
Just my PC is just lagging, you know.
Okay. No, but we will have the question, so it will be okay. And the first question will go to Mr. Hadi Setiwan. And that would be 2 questions, actually. Yes. If I may ask here, Mahmoud. Yeah. Yes. Hadi? Yes.
Okay, so thank you, Hadi, for your presentation. It is a good presentation. It's come from economic perspective. My question, actually, first one, how did you estimate the impact of CBAM on Indonesia at macro level? I saw in case of Uzbekistan, they have CBTAL. This is the IMF model. But my question for Indonesia, how did you estimate it for the impact on macro level? This is the first question. Second question, you mentioned that you have already introduced environmental tax and carbon tax at different level. Do you think this is the introduction of carbon tax reduce the possible impact of Indonesian exports to Europe?
Okay, thank you, Mahmoud. For the first one, actually we calculate the impact on the macro indicator is based on the using the CGE model. The think tank in Indonesia named CSIS conduct this study, and then they use the computable general equilibrium model, and also we did the study based on the GIM-E3 Ministry of Trade and supported by the UNOPS, and using the GIM-E3 CG model calculate the impact of the CBAM. It's also find that the impact of the CBAM is not too significant on the macroeconomic level. That's for the one question. And then the second question, actually we already have the carbon tax regulation. We have the law on it on 2021, but the implementation is still not run yet. We delay the implementation of the carbon tax because we see that the condition, the economic condition, and also the impact of this carbon tax, it's not too good. It's not perfect if we implement this right now. So we delay the carbon tax, and then what we do the ETS, like I show you in the presentation, that we already have the emission trading system on the power sector, especially and this is already on the phase 2, on the second phase, and it already consists around 80% of the power sector, the ETS. And we also endorse the carbon trading, the carbon market, especially for the offshore carbon market. We launched the carbon exchange, as you see in my presentation, and then we hope that this carbon market, voluntary carbon market and offshore carbon market, will attract some investment to Indonesia rather than implementation of the carbon tax as tools of this incentive. I think that's Mahmoud. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadi.
Thank you so much. I think that these are very technical questions, but at the same time, we do have a lot of Minister of Finance tax administrations. Also, we have here in the room Qatar tax authorities, and also we have some in the room in the online, also some tax administrations from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and they will also be watching this video. So I would like to ask to Mr. Ulmas a question from Suranjali, who was the previous speaker in the previous panel, and very quick a question: did you estimate the inflationary and distributional consequences of the carbon tax? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we are doing it, but at this stage not. I mean, we only estimated just basic macroeconomic effects by using the CPAT model. But next week, hopefully, we will finish all the distributional and social and environmental impact assessments of the carbon tax with 3 different scenarios. So so it will be available. Like, I mean, you can see it, but not at this stage. We are working with ADB on doing this Zora estimation, how our energy prices will go, how we will do the compensation mechanisms for vulnerable groups. So everything will be covered. So very soon. So it's we started it very how say not lately, very recently, this procedure. That's why there are a lot of studies, a lot of mitigation procedures. So all of them come into once, you know. So in 2026, EU started to stop their allowances. So how we can make our expertise ready for this? How can we mitigate this? Everything is pressurized. So we're working, and hopefully, I mean, in the near coming months, we will finish all the studies and impact assessments.
Thank you so much. I think that both of you have given us the kind of the responses from CBAM from ADB countries, and we will take a break, and then after we will look at the measure implementation of the CBAM. We'll look at 2 case studies, and that will be from Neil Foster McGregor from the Asian Development Bank, and then from Nadia Moskova from the DIW Economic. So welcome back. We do have our Mahmoud, would you like to close the door? We need to close the door here because we are at the Faculty of Law at Leiden University, and you see so many colleagues, but we managed to have 2 representatives from Qatar tax authorities, Mahmoud, one of the co-organizers from Qatar University, Jason Ruda from International Law here at Leiden, and Taufik Adianto from Indonesia, PhD student. Just to let you know who is in the room, you can see who is in the room online. So let me introduce the last part of today. Today we'll have the 3rd part, that is measuring implementation of CBAM, case studies, and we have Neil Foster McGregor, and will be he's from the Asian Development Bank, and then we had Nadia Mankovsa. She's from the case study of Kazakhstan, and she's from a think tank, the DIW Econ GmbH. Germany, of course, that is very clear, I think is Germany. So we will have first Neil, please. Neil, go ahead. The floor is yours. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Irma. So yes, so I feel a little bit of an imposter in this session in a way, because my paper is neither about implementation nor is it a case study. Instead, what it looks to do is to quantitatively look at the impact on Asia, but also other regions and countries of CBAM, but also to think a little bit more broadly about other scenarios. So some of the things we looked at were, what if we were to consider an extension of CBAM and ETS beyond the EU to, say, other OECD and other Asia and so on? So if there were coordination mechanisms that allowed that, what would be the impact of CBAM on global emissions and the structure of production, for example? We also look at aspects related to technological convergence. So what if it was the case that perhaps, as Anna mentioned earlier, about if CBAM revenue was used to help developing economies to improve the technology levels and become more efficient in terms of their emissions, what would that impact have on global emissions and structure of production and so on? So in some sense, it builds upon some of the earlier work. It builds on what Hadi presented earlier, perhaps a generalization to some extent of what Hadi presented. And that's what we're looking to do. So this work is sort of joint with Joe Francois from the World Trade Institute in Bern, and it was also undertaken a little while ago. So the actual implementation of this preceded the pilot phase of CBAM. So some of the newer sort of developments are not captured in the results. So with that introduction, let me move to the core of the paper. Now, I won't spend many seconds on the first couple of slides because this is all I think well known. But maybe in terms of this slide, I think that the important things to highlight is that the EU is not alone in terms of undertaking efforts to decarbonize, to set a price on carbon in order to sort of shift producers to more emissions efficient production methods. But it is an exception. It's an exception in a few ways, and obviously a couple of those are in the coverage, so it covers all EU countries. It's not a single jurisdiction, a single country initiative. It covers all EU countries, in fact, beyond EU countries, because some other OECD countries are covered by it. It also is sort of fairly broad in terms of coverage, and it's also fairly broad it's also sort of very notable in terms of its carbon price. So since 2020, the carbon price of EU carbon permits increased quite dramatically, and they've sort of hovered between that 60 and 100 euros per metric ton since then. So although it's not the only jurisdiction implementing these kind of carbon prices, it is sort of unique in many ways. And I guess it's that uniqueness that also sort of presents the problem. So by being a front runner, you sort of observe the problems early on. And obviously the major problem that the EU is facing is that in a world of global value chains, global production networks, and so on, if you put a carbon price and raise costs for domestic producers, the likelihood is that production is going to shift out of your jurisdiction to other economies. So we have this aspect of carbon leakage. And although evidence to date suggests that carbon leakage has not been particularly strong, there is an expectation that carbon prices will need to rise in the coming years. And as we've seen, they already have risen. So this sort of potential for carbon leakages is certainly exists. And that, I think, is a sort of major rationale, therefore, for why we have CBAM. But there are also a couple of other things. So one is certainly this competitiveness aspect, that the idea that we may lead to sort of a shift of production out of the EU elsewhere. But there is also an intention, at least in the original CBAM documents, to sort of encourage lower global emissions, as well as to sort of encourage the ambition or increase the ambition of other countries in sort of improving their carbon mitigation efforts. And I think these two other aspects are also crucial for the kind of work that we've been doing, because it's not just about competitiveness, it's also about this idea of lowering emissions and raising ambitions. And so some of the work we've done is to sort of think of scenarios in which that happens, and then sort of map out the potential effects on global emissions and so on. But our main question is this one at the bottom, and that is, what are the likely impacts on Asian GDP, exports and welfare of CBAM and some of these other scenarios that we will talk about in a second. And these impacts are likely to be varied for several reasons. But one of them is due to this what I'm trying to show in this slide, which just plots different indicators of emissions intensity. So emissions per unit of value added, emissions per unit of value added in manufacturing, and emissions per capita. And essentially what we're trying to show here is that there are at least three ways in which CBAM can impact heterogeneously across different countries and regions. One of them is due to the scale of activity. So simply the fact that some countries are producing more than others, and the obvious examples there. The second aspect is that countries also produce with different technologies. So some are just simply more emissions efficient in terms of their production technologies. And a third is that countries and regions also have different economic structures, which are different in terms of their emissions intensities. And I mean, a simple example in the context of this picture is that if we look at the Republic of Korea, you see it has a relatively low emissions per unit of value added, the orange bar. It's quite low, both in terms of the other bars, but also in terms of other regions and countries, reflecting the fact that it's quite emissions efficient. It's sort of relatively on the frontier of technology, and therefore it's relatively emissions efficient. But it has a relatively high emissions per capita, reflecting the fact that although it's emissions efficient, it produces a lot. So we see these different aspects, and you can see heterogeneity across countries and regions in terms of these three different dimensions. So we'd expect CBAM to have different effects on different parts of Asia, but also different parts of the world, due to these three different aspects of emissions efficiency, so to speak. The way we try and capture those aspects and those effects is through a computable general equilibrium model, which I'm not going to spend any time discussing. It was also a variant of that was also used by Hardy in his presentation about an hour and a half ago. But essentially what that does, it brings together a mathematical model, a set of data, and some exogenous parameters, such as the estimated impact of steel production to carbon prices, for example. It brings them all together in a logical framework with the intention of trying to capture both the direct effects of policy change. So, for example, what is the impact directly on steel production if there's a carbon price on steel in the EU, but also those indirect effects. So if we have that carbon price on steel in the EU, what happens to upstream suppliers to the steel sector? What happens to downstream consumers, both within the EU but also elsewhere? So it's trying to capture those sort of direct and indirect effects. It's probably useful to point out at this point that there's a huge caveat to all of this, and that is that it's not intended as a forecast. It really is intended as a quantitative exercise to try and understand both these direct effects, but also these effects that ripple across countries and sectors through linkages, through supply chain linkages, for example. But that's the sort of model we use. I won't go into any more details because we don't have much time, and it's also, I guess, not the priority for what we're trying to say. But using that model, we start from a baseline, and the baseline is very simple, and that is that there is an emissions trading scheme that exists in the EU, and that the carbon price for that emissions trading scheme is 18 euros per metric ton. The reason for choosing that value is that that was essentially the value in 2017, which is also the reference year for the data set we use. So that's the sort of starting point. So everything that we then present is relative to that baseline. And we then discuss several scenarios, and I'll just quickly go through them. The first one, and I listed 1 to 9 there, as you can see. The first one essentially is that we keep the emissions trading scheme. We do not introduce CBAM, but we raise the price from 18 euros to 100 euros, which is essentially what we witnessed between 2017 and 2020, for example. In the second scenario, we then introduce CBAM. So CBAM is implemented on the same ETS sectors as was enforced 2017, at the same price of 100 euros per metric ton. And then in the third and fourth scenarios, we sort of address this question about what if there was some kind of coordination, and we were able to extend ETS and CBAM beyond the EU, firstly to all OECD economies, and secondly to OECD economies plus the ADB member economies. So that's the first 4 scenarios. The second 4 are fairly easy because they are exactly the same, but they double the price of carbon from 100 euros to 200 euros per metric ton. And you may think that's a bit excessive, and you may be right, but I think we did this for 2 reasons. One is because, again, there is this expectation that carbon prices will need to rise if we're to meet the IPCC targets, but also because we wanted to show that maybe actually in reality, at least given what we know about the responsiveness of production and so on to carbon prices, maybe we can show that actually emissions and global GDP are actually not that sensitive to a higher carbon price. And that's we'll talk about that in a moment. And then the final scenario, this scenario 9, is where we have this price of 200 euros per metric ton across the EU, across the OECD, and across Asian economies. But then we also allow for some convergence in emission intensities. So essentially we're saying we're lowering this technology gap between Asian economies and the OECD. So if we reduce that gap by half, so essentially allowing countries to be more emissions efficient, what would be the impact on emissions and upon GDP and exports and so on? So those are the sort of nine scenarios we work through. And there are a huge amount of results, and I'm going to struggle to present even the ones I've got on the slides in a reasonable amount of time. So I'll just highlight a few main points from these results. So this slide shows the estimated emissions reductions from those different scenarios, again relative to the baseline of 18 euros per metric ton. So we have the 9 bars there. Reading from bottom to top, they represent the 9 scenarios. So the bottom one represents just the ETS increase in price from 18 to 100. The one at the top represents the 200 euro price in Asia, EU, and OECD, plus that emissions intensity convergence. And I think there are 3 or 4 points that I'd like to highlight in this figure. The first is that irrespective of whether we have CBAM or not, if carbon pricing is limited to the EU, the reductions in global emissions are relatively small. So if you look at the bottom 2 bars and the 5th and 6th bar, you see they're the smallest bars. So they're suggesting that even with a carbon price of around 200 euros, emissions reductions at the global level would be around 2%, so relatively minor. So that's the sort of first conclusion. A second is that there is evidence of carbon leakage, and we'll come back to this on the next slide. So in the context of that bottom bar, if we actually translated that into amounts rather than just percentage changes, that's equivalent to about a 360 million ton reduction in CO2 emissions. But the reduction in the EU is actually much bigger than that. It's 490 million. But this is being offset by production shifting outside of the EU to other regions, and that raises emissions elsewhere by 132 million tons, suggesting a carbon leakage rate of about 27%. So just simply the ratio of that 132 and 490. When we introduce CBAM, so the second bar from the bottom, we do see that that carbon leakage rate diminishes to around 13%. So in a sense, what we're showing, or what the estimates suggest, is that CBAM works. Not fully, it doesn't eliminate carbon leakage, but it does have that effect of reducing carbon leakage rate. So there is some evidence, at least from the model, that's the case. And then two final comments. The third is that if we compare the ETS and CBAM in Europe to then introducing it in the OECD and especially in Asia, we see much larger reductions in emissions. So efforts at coordination and expanding carbon pricing beyond Europe to cover OECD and especially Asia, I say, can see much larger reductions. So then we get reductions of up to sort of 15% in the case of a high carbon price and a broad coverage. And then the fourth comment is that this CO2 intensity convergence, so efforts to sort of spread technology around the globe, especially to Asia, also has relatively large effects. That reduces emissions by a further 2%, so more than actually the CBAM implemented in the EU. So there are sort of initial conclusion is that CBAM itself will not have huge effects on global emissions, but if we think beyond the EU to sort of broader coverage and think about flanking mechanisms, using CBAM revenue, for example, to share knowledge, then we can see much larger reductions. So turning to the case of Asia and focusing explicitly on the European carbon pricing mechanisms, so both ETS and CBAM, what we see is that carbon leakage that I mentioned on the previous slide, much of that actually goes to Asian economies. So they benefit from having an ETS because they see increases in their production. There is carbon leakage to Asia, and that is a big cause of this sort of offsetting effect. And you see that in India and China, for example, that they benefit greatly in terms of this carbon leakage out of the EU. At the same time, again, CBAM does reduce carbon leakage. So again, maybe just compare the blue and the orange bars, and you see that the orange bars are generally below the blue bars, suggesting that the extent of carbon leakage is reduced by CBAM. And in some cases, that reduction is relatively large. Again, look at India and China, for example, where the difference between the blue and the orange is quite large. So again, but Asia is sort of capturing much of that carbon leakage that we observe in the model, but CBAM does help alleviate that to a decent extent, at least. So that's a sort of effect on emissions, both global emissions, but also sort of observing the sort of structural changes that lead to a reallocation of emissions across countries and regions. This slide focuses on GDP effects. And again, I'm just focusing on the European pricing schemes and also just focusing upon Asian regions and countries. In a more general sense, and this sort of aligns very strongly with what Hadi said earlier, what we tend to find is that CBAM has a relatively small effect on emissions, as does the EU ETS. So in the context of raising the carbon price from 18 to 100 euro in the ETS, that has an impact of about 0.5% on global GDP, so relatively minor. And the impact of CBAM on top of that, so then introducing CBAM, is minimal. And what this figure here shows is that while that is the case at the global level, in some cases, the introduction of CBAM can have stronger effects. So if we look at the case of Central and Western Asia, if we look at the case of the Pacific, for example, the difference between the blue and the orange bars is at least relatively large, suggesting that CBAM is having a bit more of an impact in those economies by reducing their GDP further than just having a carbon price in place in the European Union. But again, these are relatively small effects. We're looking at 0.2, 0.3%. And maybe one final thing to mention is that effects, again, are heterogeneous across regions. And what we tend to observe, both in the context of Asia, but also when we look more globally, is that those regions that are closer to the EU suffer more in terms of GDP declines. Again, that's expected. They have stronger trade linkages and so on, but we observe that in the model. So just to finish off, this is the last slide. I already know I'm already over time, so I'll be very quick with this one, is if we think about those other scenarios where we extend CBAM and ETS beyond the EU to Asia, to OECD, and when we introduce this sort of emissions intensity convergence, we do find some additional results that I think are relatively interesting in thinking more broadly about carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The first is that if we expand ETS and CBAM to OECD economies, then we see that this tends to benefit Asian economies. So there's some kind of free rider problem. Leaving countries out of these kind of mechanisms does allow them to benefit in terms of GDP. So there is this kind of free rider problem. When we expand CBAM and ETS to also include Asian economies, then we do see that there are relatively large losses for countries like China and India, as well as East Asia. And again, this captures the idea that rather than just the EU suffering the cost, I guess, of decarbonisation, if we extend the coverage, if there's coordination, then those costs are shared more broadly. And I guess that's not a straightforward question to answer whether that's desirable or not, given that it's often the middle-income economies that will suffer more, but at least we observe that in the data. And then the final point on this is the technological convergence, this idea of bringing technology levels in Asia up towards those of the EU through various means of support, actually leads to substantial gains in GDP for Asian economies. So this is, in a way, a win-win. If we combine carbon pricing with technological convergence, not only do we see the largest reductions in emissions, we also see substantial gains in GDP for those economies that are further behind economically. So those are a summary of some of the results we find. This is a fairly messy conclusion, but let me just make a couple of points just to reiterate one or two of the things I've said. So essentially what we find in terms of CBAM is that it does reduce carbon leakage, especially to the EU, to Asia, where much of that carbon leakage takes place. But global emissions are only affected modestly. Similarly, and consistent with what Hadi presented, the effect on GDP is also modest, but that effect is somehow disproportionate, and middle-income economies often suffer disproportionately from that. In results not presented, you also see distributional effects within economies, because certain sectors, CBAM sectors, ETS sectors are affected more strongly. That means that workers potentially are affected more strongly in those sectors. So what we show beyond that is that if we really want to be serious about reducing global emissions, then we need to think about coordination and expansion of the coverage of ETS and CBAM to other regions. And Asia there is crucial, given its role in global production networks and given its relatively high emissions, well, both in absolute and relative terms. So expanding can be a means of reducing emissions, but that has consequences for global GDP. And this aspect of technology transfer, therefore, maybe using CBAM revenues in a productive way globally, is something that I think should be considered, because that's one way of of offsetting these negative GDP effects. And a final very pessimistic comment based upon our analysis is that even in the most optimistic scenario, where we have coordinated carbon pricing in Asia, OECD, and the EU, and when we have this technology transfer that's improving the emissions intensity of Asia, we see a reduction in global emissions of about 17%. Now, in the data we have, given average global growth, it would only take 4 years of global growth to offset that 17% reduction, suggesting that neither carbon pricing nor these technology effects by themselves, technology diffusion by themselves, are going to be enough. And there is a need, therefore, to think about broader innovation initiatives and also more general behavioral change. Thank you, and apologies for going a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, Neil. I think that we will have time for some questions, so please ask them in the chat. I will make sure after the second presentation we may have 1 or 2 questions, and so please raise your hand. No, just put them in the chat because it's easy to manage. So I will give the word to Nadia. Nadia, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So you see the first slide. Hello. So my name is Nadia Mankovska, and I will talk today about the impact of the CBAM for the case of Kazakhstan. I will present insights of several our studies. Just a moment. Move this panel. Which I participated in or led them. I worked for DIGICCTAX. This is consultancy company of German Institute of Economic Research, DIW Berlin. And DIW Berlin, as a big think tank, was also on the roots of elaboration and implementation of CBAM regulation for the European Union. And we, as 100% of subsidiary of DIW Berlin, tried to move to transfer the knowledge and provide consultancy services for public and private sector, especially internationally. And this, what I present now is other insights of for the projects in Kazakhstan. We did several projects also for the European Commission, Ukraine, doing currently for Uzbekistan and other countries. In Kazakhstan, it will not be a case study, but the insights from several research projects. In Kazakhstan, we work since 2011 and tried to, in the first project, we helped to develop a strategy of a transition of the economy of Kazakhstan to the green economy. So we are always kept updated and aware of all the economic pathways that are going on in Kazakhstan. And in 2019, we started a project financed by Federal Ministry of Environment and led by GIZ about supporting green economy in Kazakhstan, and we helped to elaborate the strategy of Kazakhstan to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So a sub-project, we made an analysis, we conducted an analysis of potential impact of CBAM on Kazakhstan. Later on, we provided some technical advisory for Kazakh experts in framework of United Nations Industrial Development Organization, and we consulted the government of Kazakhstan on ongoing changes in design and regulation of CBAM, and of course of pitfalls and challenges because of our continuous exchange of ideas and findings with the researchers at DIW who also were involved in the elaboration process of CBAM with the European Commission. So as soon as CBAM was announced, there were high concerns in Kazakhstan from the side of government, from the side of experts, and they were asking for answers about the potential harm and potential mitigation strategies. And particularly at early stages of CBAM elaboration, negative impact on export growth, employment was emphasized in several studies, including high think tanks as World Bank. And these concerns have been somewhat tempered, as we saw today in the presentations. So the studies, current studies and most recent studies conclude that overall economic impact will be limited. And our research and our assessment followed a similar pattern. The first analysis which we did in 2020, we took the macroeconomic model of CG model of Kazakhstan and took the design of ETS or European ETS, the carbon prices, looked at the sectors and tried to estimate the impact with the help of macroeconomic model, which was actually from up to down approach, and it turned out that our assessment was the negative effects were way overestimated. Those days we lacked information about the calibration rules, about the benchmark application and the design of CBAM. And the subsequent research, we accounted for the coverage of products, calculation formula, benchmarks. We prepared much more accurate projections. So What about case of Kazakhstan? If we consider Kazakhstan production and export numbers, we see that the CBAM will affect the most sector of aluminium, while other products will show only marginal effects. We see that iron metallurgical sector export to the EU is less than 1,000 tons, and it's a little bit more than 1,000 tons of ammonia. Cement is near and is almost not exported. And if we see the projections of trade pattern and sectoral based, we also cannot expect that sector cement and ammonia export will grow in near future. This is because of high transportation costs, and CBAM will only exacerbate this effect. The future of metallurgical sector is open because of new opportunities and new markets which open for Kazakhstan metallurgical producers. We see that Russian metallurgical sector is sanctioned, and Ukrainian metallurgical sector is destroyed because of Russian rockets. So the markets of the EU provide some opportunities for Kazakhs. The aluminium production exports about a third of total product to the Europe. So we can look at the sector of aluminium more precisely and analyze its effect. For the analysis of sectoral effects, the EVA-CON has developed an iterative tool. It's in Excel. And we conducted several trainings for Kazakh exporters, so it's user-friendly, and the user can define the expected export volumes, carbon prices, design of some calculations, kind of benchmarks, or the emission intensity of the product, and estimate the CBAM payments. When we make a closer look at the sector of aluminium production, we see that in Kazakhstan we have only one producer of aluminium, and about 90% of the total aluminium produced in the country goes to export, and a third goes to the EU. Currently, the producer can, of course, decide on the technology it uses, whether it invests in more in less carbon intensive technology, or keeps its production capacity as it is. Currently, for the manufacturer of Kazakhstan aluminium, the default using of default benchmark is much more favorable as using its own carbon emissions data. So if we take the default benchmarks and we take the export level of 1990, the low level of Kazakh ETC, I checked today whether it remains the same low level of carbon price in Kazakhstan. It's still very low. This is the same as here reported. And EU price level. We took those days $82, now it's 76. So we have probably a little bit too high estimation, but it's not important here. We see that the manufacturer of aluminium of Kazakhstan will have to pay in a framework of CBAM payments about $9 million in 2026, and by 2035 it has to pay 40 million. It's about in terms of percentage of export value to the EU, it will be about a fifth, and about in the total export of aluminium, it will be about a little bit more than 7% of total export of aluminium. It's about the other sectors, the payments to the EU will be very relatively low. Ammonia sector will pay less than $500,000 US dollars to by 2035, and the hot metal will pay $290,000. Cement and clinker is not expected to export. But with these numbers, of course, one cannot intuitively expect significant macroeconomic effects. And this was very contrary to the initial findings of 2020. So we took the bottom-up approach and integrated our sectoral assessment into the 2CG model of Kazakhstan and looked at the overall macroeconomic effects, which takes into account the interactions between interdependency of sectors. Yes, the intuition proves right, and our initial finding proved to be too much overestimated negative effects of those days. So compared to the baseline scenario, where is no EU CBAM, but the current policies and NDC met, the loss of cumulative GDP by 2035 is projected to reach about 0.05% of GDP, which is actually a very low number. If we look at the macroeconomic perspectives, it's relatively easy to mitigate with proper macroeconomic and fiscal policies. And this corresponds to about $790 million US dollars cumulatively over the next 10 years. So the outlook which we put forward for discussion is the following. It is clear, and it's also, we got an email yesterday with a hint that there will be amendments to CBAM regulation. And we also in exchange with the researchers at DIB, we see that the CBAM regulation, which is designed now, will not remain as it is. It will have a lot of amendments, and CBAM alone will not be sufficient for the Green Deal goals, and it will take additional and supporting measures. So probably European policy will get stronger in the future. Producers outside of EU will develop a variety of strategies to avoid the impact of CBAM adjustment payments. So what I say with this statement is currently it's not a matter of government policy or fiscal policy, but it's rather the matter of the corporate policies and pathway developments, how the companies react to the CBAM regulation, how they respond to the expected payments. There are a lot of ways, and European researchers are aware of a lot of kind of possibilities to avoid these payments or mitigate the harm on a corporate level. Then we also show that there are not many recommendations for the near future for the government, and the global uncertainties have very strong impact on international commodity markets. Despite of expected insignificance of EU CBAM, Kazakhstan will address climate change issues, and the climate emission reduction remains a priority policy. But this is not the effect of CBAM regulation. CBAM regulation, which was at the beginning top of discussion and impulse for action, now comes on a backstage. DIB is a company we are ready to assist to adjust our CBAM tool and consult further detail, especially now we switched and consult more on a corporate level, how to report, and we help to assess the impact of CBAM to us. So our contacts are available in the presentation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I think that we will share the presentations with everyone, with the participants on today's workshop. There was a nice discussion also in the chat regarding the energy price and whether to take it or not take it into account. I ask you to look at the chat because I think that that's important. We have, we say 3-4 minutes for a last question, or perhaps Neil, you would like to elaborate more on what happened in the chat. That's also possible. So I will give you 2 minutes perhaps to give a small reaction to that.
Thank you. No, it was a very good question from my eyesight, but Suranjali, exactly, yeah. And essentially, it comes down to this issue of the modelling. So we have this model, which, as I said earlier, is logically consistent, and so on. But the question is, what should be included or changed in that model? And essentially, the question was, do we account for changes in energy prices, for example? So we may expect that as sort of the climate emergency becomes stronger, that there will be changes in energy prices, and again, they could go in various different directions, given that as more sort of renewable energies come on board, for example, it's not necessarily clear that we're going to see a price spike in energy and so on. But the point is that there is the likelihood that energy prices will change. The challenge will be in what direction, to what extent, no? And so I think that's the sort of issue, and that sort of led us not to include it in the model. But Suranjali's question is very good, because if we think about additional aspects beyond the simple carbon pricing, and to what extent should we introduce changes in energy prices in our modelling strategy, and essentially we didn't. We just allowed energy prices to respond to changes in demand, to changes in supply chain linkages, to changes in carbon prices and so on. But we didn't actually model at any point potential impacts on or potential changes in energy prices. And obviously, Suranjali's point is that could then change the results and actually could limit the negative impacts of CBAM. So it's one dimension that we didn't cover, but an important dimension. And I think for various reasons we didn't cover it, but I think the main one is that I think for us there's a lot of uncertainty about the direction and the size of those energy price changes that we may expect.
Thank you so much, Neil. I think that I have now 4 minutes to say what is going to happen tomorrow, because the reason why we have these two sides of the coin in terms of environmental and sustainability is because today we started with CBAM, and we started with the discussion from European law perspective, from international law, trade law, economics perspective, European, Asian perspective, also the country's experiences and the implementation. But we also need to think about how we make sure that it's not only about CBAM, but it's about, like, for instance, Nadia, when she was saying, well, CBAM is not yet significant, but still is important to have. And the other item that we have, and that will be for tomorrow, is regarding the use of reducing carbon emissions from the use of data centers. So we will go more towards this green transition. What is the artificial intelligence, data centers, and then after we go to the sustainable green EI and taxation. So we will close with taxation. We started with taxation. We didn't start with environmental. We started with taxation. We will close again with taxation, but we have gone through a nice process of how we see CBAM. Tomorrow we will talk about sustainability, environmental. So with this, I will invite everyone to be tomorrow. It will be at 9 a.m. Dutch time, that is Central European summer time. Just please make the conversion to your time. And hopefully tomorrow we will also have some questions, and all of you. And I think that the idea of this is just to create kind of some discussion on the topic and a broader perspective. So we are sharing the slides, but feel free to also have engaged in discussions among you, because that's also the idea. And thank you everyone for presenting and also for attendance of today. And we will be tomorrow at 9 a.m. Central European summer time, that is Dutch time. And please make a reference to your time. So thank you so much, everyone. 2 minutes to 1, so we will perfect on time. Thank you to Nadia, thank you to Neil, thank you to Suranjali, to Rita, to Anna, and also Ulmas and Hadi. And thank you everyone, and see you then tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.